professional tarot nerd. Today, I'm a storyteller. I'm glad you're here. This is another in the series of stories I'm calling the 13 Days of Halloween. When I was growing up out in the country as a kid, I had all kinds of adventures. Some were funny, some were exciting, others were mysterious, and even a little spooky. Now, all of these stories are true, even if they didn't happen. When I was a kid, my granny and granddaddy attended Mount Salem Church, and whenever I visited them over the weekend, they'd take me with them. Now, it was a small country church. It was quite lovely, really, and it was already old when I was a kid. Now, unlike many country churches around where I grew up, the church's cemetery wasn't nearby the church. The cemetery was a mile or so away up an old and winding little road. Mount Salem Church and its cemetery had been founded about 200 years ago by a few families of farmers that were developing that area. And although the area never developed anything like what we might call a town, over time, more families moved into the valleys in the area. Eventually, in addition to that old church, the little community built a school and a general store. Not long after the first families established their homes, they learned that they weren't the first Americans to settle in that area. There was this old man living out in the woods there. Some said he'd been called Old Man Hankins. Others said generally he was just referred to as that old man. Nobody really knew how long he'd been living out there. There were rumors of old native stories about an old man living by himself in the woods for a long time. Now, Old Man Hankins, he only came out of those woods a couple of times a year to trade for things he couldn't manage for himself. He wasn't ever friendly. He was always gruff and frequently downright rude. But folks just kept their distance and let him go about his business. But as more families moved into the area, the old man was encountered even more. Now, they said he only grew more cranky as time went on. They also said he never seemed to get any older. And with the slowly growing population came stories of strange things that happened out there in the woods. At first, hunters would come across the corpses of game animals, deer, rabbits, and the like, whose only wounds were where their hearts had been removed. Sometimes folks would see strange lights and hear unusual sounds in those woods late at night. Now, as time passed, farmers began to occasionally find livestock with missing hearts. Naturally, rumors and stories grew up around those strange things. Many of these stories revolved around that old man Hankins. Now, he still came out of the woods a couple of times a year, as cranky and as old as ever. And he rudely refused any friendly overtures anyone ever made. One night, about 150 years ago, tragedy was visited upon that little community of Mount Salem. Having gone out one day to pick blackberries, a brother and sister didn't return home by twilight as they usually did when they were on such quests. The children's father, along with several neighbors, searched the woods all night. But it wasn't until morning when the bodies of those two poor children were found. And both were missing their hearts. Children's bodies were taken to the church, and the local doctor was summoned. The grieving parents and their neighbors were told that it wasn't any animal that had taken their children. And then their grief and disbelief grew into rage and old man Hankins was blamed. Now the preacher and the doctor both begged for restraint, but the grieving father whipped his neighbors into vengeance. Those farmers armed themselves and set out to find that old man that they blamed for their tragedy. It's said that they found old man Hankins in his cabin well after dark. And it's also said they found that old man sitting within a ring of candles in his cabin, chanting in a language no one could understand. Now they dragged that old man from his home and drove him through the woods back to the church. Once there, the preacher once again begged restraint of his enraged neighbors. They said that's when the old man started to laugh and jeer. Now this only enraged those farmers more. They dragged that old man to an old oak tree just outside the graveyard where they threw a rope over a branch. Now this only encouraged more laughter from the old man, who began his unintelligible chanting once again. Well, the next day, the body of old man Hankins was buried discreetly somewhere out in those woods, and nobody seems to know where. And later, that old man's cabin, found by a hunter, burned to the ground. Now, a year passed, and life in that little community of Mount Salem started to return to normal. But on the anniversary of that fateful day, the original Mount Salem church burned to the ground. The church was rebuilt in its present location, about a mile from that cemetery. As time passed, the community grew, and with it, Mount Salem Cemetery grew as well. Eventually, the cemetery had expanded to include that old oak tree from which old man Hankins had been hung. And in time, the stories grew up around that old oak as well. Now, it was said that on certain nights of the year, if you listened closely, you could hear the sound of heartbeats coming from inside that old oak. And on the night of the anniversary of the death of old man Hankins, it was said that you could hear the sounds of the old man's mysterious chanting and his maniacal laughter. When I was a teenager, Mount Salem Cemetery was still in use in the community, and it was really a quite lovely little place. They took good care of it. Everything was tended well. And as that cemetery had grown over the years, that old oak had grown into a huge, venerable tree now at the center of that growing cemetery. Now, the cemetery groundskeepers told stories about finding the corpses of small animals from time to time scattered around that tree. All of them were missing their hearts. Well, skeptical of all these tall tales and legends and folklore, I set out on a June evening to see what I could see there in Mount Salem Cemetery. Now, I don't know what I really expected to find out there at Mount Salem, but I'm sure it wasn't much. All those stories had to be exaggerations, outright lies. By the time I got there, it was only a little bit before dusk, and I parked my car in what served as the parking lot. I was planning to stay for the duration. And all those stories I'd heard, no one had ever said that anyone had ever stayed through the night. I brought along my trusty flashlight and a paper sack with a few RC colas and some moon pies. And although it had been a hot day, it was unseasonably cool there as that sun set on Mount Salem Cemetery. Gold and orange light filtered down through the branches of that old oak. Off in the distance someplace, somebody's donkey brayed. A gray squirrel sat on a fence post there at the edge of the cemetery eating an acorn. And all around, birds chirped cheerfully in the trees. All around the cemetery, that is. Thought it odd that I didn't see any birds in the cemetery at all. I sat down with my little bag of snacks at the base of that big old oak and I waited. As dusk gave way to night, I watched as the stars slowly appeared here and there between those trees. Oh, it was dark there. I couldn't see the nearest house, and streetlights hadn't made it all the way out that way yet. Well into the night, I snacked on a moon pie and sipped my RC. Must have fallen asleep at some point leaning on that old tree. I remember a dream I had. I kind of wish I didn't. I was leaning on that tree when the night grew darker and the cool of the evening became cold. And that's when I noticed the stars didn't peek down from the sky. All I could see in the sky was an inky blackness. And when I looked around, it seemed that that inky black was closing in all around me. All I could see was that old oak tree and a patch of grass around me where I sat. And as I watched, that grass browned, withered, and died. And I couldn't move, not one muscle. While I had been nervous before, I was starting to panic now. And slowly, I began to notice a sound. Barely heard at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of a heartbeat. A heartbeat coming from inside that old tree. Thump, 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 thump. Wasn't long before that first heartbeat, slow and steady, was joined by others. Thump, thump. The sound was like a low rumble of thunder, and it didn't stop. I was really starting to panic now, weakly struggling to move, when amid the rumble of all those heartbeats, I heard an old man laugh. I'm still not sure what really happened next. I recall feeling something hit me in the head. And then again, something hit me in the head. And amid all those rumbling heartbeats, thump, thump, and that old man's laughter, I heard a new sound. It was real quiet at first, but it grew louder and louder. And I heard the sound of a gray squirrel barking an alarm call. When another acorn bounced off my head, I knew that's what it must have been. That inky black receded, and I was surrounded by an unusual light coming from inside that old oak tree. I could move again, and I didn't realize I was running until I found myself far down the road and standing outside my classmate's house. I must not have kept to that road because I found myself covered in what must have been scratches from briar and bramble. My friend let me stay the night. I just couldn't bring myself to head back down to that cemetery to get my car in the dark. The following morning, my friend drove me back from my car, and nervously I collected the remnants of my snacks and my old trusty flashlight. I still had an RC Cola left, and as I sat there taking a drink and reflecting on whatever it was that had happened to me the night before, there, on a fence post at the edge of that cemetery, was a gray squirrel sitting there, munching away on an acorn. That old oak tree is gone now. It was destroyed by lightning several years ago in June. And since then, the stories of strange things happening at Mount Salem have dwindled now, and they're largely forgotten. But I tell you, I'll never forget what I experienced on that dark June night in Mount Salem Cemetery. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I hope you've enjoyed this little story about Mount Salem Cemetery. If you did, please like, subscribe, share, comment. I'm Skaji.